Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nader Hashemi. I teach Middle East politics at Georgetown. Welcome to this book talk, From Apartheid to Democracy, A Blueprint for Peace in Israel-Palestine by Michael Schaeffer Oberman and Sarah Leah Whitson, published recently by the University of California Press. Michael Schaeffer Omerman is the Israel-Palestine director at Dawn and former editor-in-chief of Plus 972 magazine in Israel. And Sarah Leah Whitson is executive director of Dawn and formerly the executive director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa division. It's a huge personal honor for me to moderate this event. One of the affiliations I'm most proud of is my affiliation as a non-resident fellow with Dawn. The principles that they stand for, the values that they seek to uphold, the policy interventions that they make on important questions related to the contemporary Middle East are a reflection of, I think, the values that stand for a much better world. They encourage me to get up in the morning and to fight for a better world. So I'm very proud to be affiliated with Dawn. Please donate to Dawn if you can. Please attend our annual dinner that takes place in Washington, D.C. every year. It's the highlight of my year. And please buy, most importantly for today, the first Dawn book that we are here to discuss, From Apartheid to Democracy, A Blueprint for Peace in Israel-Palestine. This book has received rave reviews. It's a book that seeks to sort of provide an alternative to the illusion of the two-state solution that came out of the Oslo Accords, and that is still the operating framework, at least until recently, adopted by the international community. Michael and Sarah challenge this approach, presenting a roadmap to end ongoing Israeli crimes and create a human rights and democratic centered sort of solution to this particular conflict. One of the reviews that caught my attention and that I just wanted to share with everyone at the outset is Omar Dejani's review. He's a professor of law at the University of the Pacific, and he writes about this book. Many visions for the future of Israel-Palestine have been articulated, but scant attention has been given to what it will take, practically speaking, to achieve them. Drawing on meticulous research about the law and politics of Israel-Palestine and best practices elsewhere, From Apartheid to Democracy fills that void. It's a step-by-step plan for a transition to an equal and peaceful future for Israelis and Palestinians, and it raises provocative questions. But in a world where policymakers have shown little willingness to do more than wring their hands about the tragedy in the Middle East when they're not washing them entirely, it's a provocation that's long overdue. The format for this afternoon is that our authors are going to give a presentation on the core arguments of the book. We're going to engage afterwards in a back and forth. I have some questions that I'll pose to them, and then we'll turn it over to you, members of the audience, to pose questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Of course, the context that shapes this particular book launch is the context that you're all familiar with. We're living in the era of Donald Trump's Gaza peace plan and this spectacle that we saw in Davos last week with Jared Kushner's presentation on the future of the Gaza Strip. And of course, all of this has been validated by a UN Security Council resolution that was passed in November. I'm hoping we can talk about those themes as well, and I'm sure we will. Let me turn the floor over now to Sarah and Michael to get us started. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. And I'm so excited to have an opportunity to talk about this book on Dawn's own Zoom platform. This project has been a long time coming. I thought we would start the discussion by allowing me to give a little bit of context and background as to how this book came into being and what it aims to do before we dip into the details, the practical, hard details of what it is that we're proposing. A couple of years ago, I think it was actually back in 2020, I was on a train ride to Washington, D.C. And to make a long train ride story short, it turned out I was sitting next to a gentleman who works for APAC. And over the course of the several hours, when we somehow inevitably found ourselves discussing Israel-Palestine, we came to a bit of an impasse with me arguing that the occupation was illegal, that the apartheid regime to which Israel subjected Palestinians was a crime, and to his position of throwing up his arms and saying, well, what if I accept? What if I concede that the occupation has to end? And you're telling me there's no two-state solution under the Oslo framework. What exactly is it that you're proposing? What do you want us to do? Do you want people to just Israeli Jews to just jump into the sea? An often heard retort of Palestinian aspirations for Israelis. And, at that moment, it struck me that I didn't have the answer, that it wasn't clear to me anybody had the answer, but that an answer was something that we urgently needed. Mind you, this was well before the genocide in Gaza, well before the expansions of settlements, even before much of the developments of Israeli normalization in the Middle East. Um, that's really the question, the challenge that we set out to answer in this book, which is to offer a positive normative prescription for how to fix the very broken reality of Israel-Palestine. And neither Mike nor I are experts in this kind of future planning because we are at heart critics, analysts, experts at investigating and examining and describing facts as we see them, subjecting them to legal analysis and political analysis. But like most people in the fields of journalism and public policy and human rights, we really don't do a lot of prescribing for future scenarios. And so this was as taxing a challenge for my imagination, for Mike's imagination, as it will be for you, our dear audience, because we are asking a lot of our readers and we're asking a lot of our audience here today. And that is to join us in this exercise of imagination, to ask ourselves if we could reconfigure the reality of Israel-Palestine today, how would we reconfigure it? What would we do to fix the broken governance, to address the ongoing crimes that we face? And the reality is that those of us who work on these issues relating to Israel-Palestine really don't have answers and haven't had answers for quite a long while. We have come to, I think, a broad consensus, one that I've been pushing for many years, now that a number of authors have solidified that the Oslo two-state solution process has failed. We have come to the recognition that we currently face a one-state apartheid reality. But what we've discovered, as Mike will elaborate, is that there is no plan to replace the failed Oslo two-state solution. And that is what we set out to do. And that, given the realities of today, is why it takes so much imagination to imagine, to envision a different reality than the bleak, catastrophic reality we're facing today. I think everyone can agree that we are in a particular moment that is ripe for new ideas. And the shock of the Gaza genocide has certainly played one helpful role in jolting the international community out of its slumber. But what's still missing is this credible, actionable plan for what should follow. As I mentioned, we recognize certain starting points. We concede as givens we take notice of certain facts, that there is a one-state reality in Israel-Palestine today, what we call the territory that covers between the river and the sea, that Israel's occupation is illegal, and as the International Court of Justice has affirmed following our drafting of the book, that this occupation is illegal and it must be brought to an end immediately. That Israel's one-state regime is an apartheid regime. Additionally, that Gaza remains occupied, ceasefire or not. So our goal has been to figure out how to end these crimes and create an environment for decision making that is democratic in nature. Um, Mike, do you want to jump in here on the missing policy link and how our plan breaks with other plans? We keep tossing
Yeah,
around the order of our presentation to keep ourselves fresh, so.
yeah. First off, thank you, Nader, for joining us and for that lovely introduction. I look forward to hearing your questions and engaging in the conversation about them. Um, as Sarah Lee set out, our starting point is that the Oslo process has failed, that there's a one-state reality, meaning Israel is the effective sovereign power exercising most of the control, if not all of the control between the river and the sea, and that the crimes of apartheid and occupation, which that control, which that one-state reality, how it manifests, must come to an end. Now, as Sarah Lee mentioned, we both work and have worked for decades in the field of describing the wrongs and maybe even asking for negative policy prescriptions for how to address them. And I often say that in meetings that I've had with tons of diplomats over the years, I've always, at least for the last decade, gotten a clear sense that people understand that the two-state process, the two-state vision, as it was articulated in Oslo and in the 3 decades since, is dead. That the Israeli government, successive Israeli governments, have effectively pledged to ensure that it never happens, and that leaves us without any path forward. However, because the international community has dedicated itself and effectively sworn its loyalty to this two-state process, they've been unwilling to look at any alternatives. And that's what we set out to do. So again, as Sarah Lee mentioned, there are other people out there with ideas of what to do. There are lots of dedicated Palestinian and Israeli and international activists and thinkers and academics and policymakers who have looked at this, but for the most part, they fall into one or two categories. Either negative prescriptions, meaning sanctions or isolation or pressure on Israel or carrots for Israel to change its behavior, um, or a vision of what an end state could look like. And that's, one democratic state, that's a land for all, the Confederation folks. There's ideas for federation, and of course, the traditional two-staters who continue to lobby for that outcome. What they're all missing is how to get from point A to point B. And that's the crux of the plan that we set out to make. So instead of trying to start from a point where where sorry. Um, so our starting point is that these crimes of apartheid and occupation need to end. And to do that, just to give a quick overview, we envision a transitional government for a 3-year transition, which creates a political and civil rights playing field that is level for Palestinians and Israelis, such that once the crimes of apartheid and occupation are ended, that Israelis and Palestinians can choose for themselves which of these final visions, which of these sort of final outcomes they want to live in and decide democratically. To do that, our process here was we interviewed over 100 stakeholders and experts and scholars and Palestinians and Israelis on the ground across the world, asking what is missing today? What's missing from the processes that have failed in the past? What did they get right? What did they get wrong? We did extensive comparative research into other post-colonial and democratic transitions, again, to see what worked and what failed, not because there's a one-size-fits-all answer for any of this, but because, put simply, there are lessons to be learned. Um, and we can get into that a little bit more. And of course, because this was published by an academic press, it underwent peer review by five scholars of relevant topics here: Palestine, Israel, conflict resolution, human rights, etc. So I'm going to give a quick overview of what the plan is itself, and then I'll kick it back to Sarah Lee to talk about sort of how we envision this can be used and what its value is in today's world, particularly in the post-Kushner Trump era of recolonization of a different type of parts of Palestine. So, as I mentioned, the first stage of the blueprint is the establishment of a caretaker government. This has to happen with the acceptance and buy-in of Palestinians and Israelis. We're not talking about a foreign military intervention here. We're talking about what happens if the pressure that activists and world leaders are trying to put on Israel is successful, and what is the positive demand for that? So what is the off-ramp for those sanctions? And a transition out of an apartheid occupation rule is the answer to that, and this is what it looks like. So a caretaker government comprised of Palestinian and Israelis with sort of radical inclusion for groups that are not necessarily included in the current political representation. Again, Palestine hasn't had valid elections for decades, and Israel's ruled by criminals. Um, and so there needs to be a change in those who are responsible for making the transformation, with a set of guiding principles, a sort of temporary constitution to guide the process. And to emphasize again, this is a locally led process, but with sort of international supervision and support. The first actions of that transitional government will be to end military rule and the apartheid laws, to restore freedom of movement for everybody within the territory. Restrictions on movement have been one of the most critical and central ways that Israel has controlled Palestinians and stymied their political aspirations and development over the years. And just removing those will be a huge step toward remedying a lot of the wrongs that are in place today. We replaced the Israeli High Court with a special High Court for the transition, recognizing that the Israeli judicial system has been a participant and not a restrainer in its apartheid and occupation rule over the years. Um, Extension of citizenship to all people, integration of police and security forces. This primarily happens by barring any military force from operating within the territory and instead insisting on civilian policing with an integrated national Israeli-Palestinian police force, followed by, well, not followed by, but concurrent with a comprehensive disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration plan, drawing on lessons from around the world. Um, there's one area where we don't have all the answers for, and that is transitional justice. However, we do believe that the blueprint um, very much addresses all of the, or most of the sort of institutional pillars of that transitional justice. We don't resolve the entire refugee issue. We don't, restitution is not something that we have a comprehensive answer for. And it's not because these aren't important issues that need to be resolved, but because those are things that need to be decided upon and designed and built by stakeholders themselves and not from the outside. However, we believe that those questions it'll be possible to answer them and to resolve those issues once you have a more functioning democratic system and once you end the crimes of apartheid and democracy. And the end of the plan, where the sort of the bookend of what we set out to describe and to present and to ideate, is democratic elections. These can or cannot be followed, although we highly encourage that they are followed by a referendum on whether people want to continue to live in one democratic state or separate into two or adopt one of the confederation or federalist models, with the key difference in doing that after a process like this being that if such a referendum fails, the fallback is a democratic reality without apartheid and without occupation. Whereas if you were to hold one today and it failed, the fallback would be occupation, apartheid, and ongoing genocide. Um, that's the sort of the plan in short. There's obviously many, many more details and explanations, and I encourage you all to read the book to sort of understand a little bit better what we propose and how we propose it. But I'll pass it back to Sarah Lee now to get the missing component.
Yeah, I mean, this is a complex book and it's a very detailed policy wonky book in many ways. But if there were two critical features of the blueprint that we propose, a 3-year transitional government that we propose, that I hope you'll remember, is that I think the plan is radical and breaks with traditional and failed peace and conflict resolution approaches, not just in Israel-Palestine, but often in other contexts as well, in two critical respects. Number one, we prioritize ending Israeli crimes ahead of issues of governance. Traditionally, in much of peace and conflict resolution, the effort has always been to focus on governance issues as the top priority, typically accompanied by a constitution and elections. We think, in the context of Israel-Palestine, that is the wrong approach. This was the approach of Oslo, where the ending of Israeli crimes was conditioned on resolution on questions of governance and statehood. The failure to resolve questions of statehood in the two-state solution model meant that the default is the continuation of Israeli occupation, and of course, as we've seen, the vast expansion of Israeli crimes with expanded settlements, ongoing military attacks, culminating in the ongoing genocide now. And that is a mistake. And so our approach prioritizes ending these Israeli crimes of occupation and apartheid as the first order of priority for the transitional government. For the short life of the transitional government, the 3-year period, we set out to revoke the legal infrastructure, the institutions that undergird Israeli occupation and apartheid, and to replace them with a democratic rule. The second way in which the blueprint breaks with traditional peace and conflict resolution approaches is in its radical commitment to democracy and democratic decision making. So this is not something that we merely have as ideals, but we seek to put them in practice by giving the people who live between the river and the sea the ultimate decision making on how they want to configure their future governance. We believe that is the meaning of self-determination. That is how self-determination can best be fulfilled. And we reject the Oslo process approach, which is now on steroids in the Trump 20-point plan of designating representatives for Israelis and Palestinians to decide on their behalf what future governance should look like. We think, first of all, that relies on a faulty assumption that Palestinians and Israeli Jews can be flattened into a single dimension, such that the only thing that's relevant about an individual human being's opinions and beliefs and choices is their identity as a Palestinian or as an Israeli Jew, which would therefore make it acceptable to have a representative effectively deciding on their behalf, voting on their behalf. Nor do we believe that the Palestinian Authority has the legitimacy, the electoral legitimacy, to make such decisions on behalf of Palestinians, nor do we believe does the criminal Israeli leadership currently in place have the legitimacy, legal or moral, to make such decisions on behalf of Israeli Jews. And finally, we do not wish to see people who are making decisions about their governance make those decisions exclusively on the basis of their national or religious identity. And we hope very much, and we even expect or count on, and here I'm foreshadowing some of the critiques of the blueprint, that Palestinian voters or Israeli Jewish voters may often find that they overlap in certain ideas and opinions, such that secular Palestinians and secular Israeli Jews may choose a similar kind of governance versus religious Palestinians and religious Israelis who have more ideological commitments to their national/religious identity may find that they share the same opinion on what future governance should look like. That is a big, big, big challenge that we're setting forth, and I hope in our discussion we can probe that a little bit because I realize that that approach, in essence, may be subject to the same criticism that Rob Malley and Hussein Agha have about the Oslo process itself, which is that it is an overly technocratic one that fails to truly understand the hearts and minds, hearts in particular, of the people who live between the river and the sea and their ideological commitments or slash fixations. Um, what we are hoping this book will provide is an opportunity to think about new ideas and new approaches. As Mike mentioned, what we don't solve for is the absence of political will that's sufficient for a transformation now. Because the starting point here is the Israeli public's consent to a transitional government under what we think is a possible outcome, the weight of international and domestic pressure, and the Palestinian public as well, but recognizing that power resides, excuse me, with Israelis. We do believe, however, and this reflects our hope in humanity, our hope in the humanity of Israeli Jews, above all, that they will not choose the alternative. The alternative we see is the continuation and completion of a full genocide and full displacement of the Palestinian people from Palestine. I believe that that is the only alternative to the status quo, and I am very, very hopeful that the Israeli public will reject that fate, will reject responsibility for that, and will choose an option that we believe is better suited to the modern world of a multi-ethnic society, is more likely to produce peace and security for Israeli Jews as well as for Palestinians. But critically, what we're trying to do is to provide that alternative and that off-ramp to genocide and displacement, and give people an option that whether they're international policymakers or whether they are the people who actually live on the ground, is a credible alternative. Um, we do have a few sort of frequently asked questions, but maybe we can save those for the discussion. And if they don't come up, I'll tee them up myself. But how we really want to use the blueprint and why this event is so important to Mike and me and other events that we're going to be having is that we are seeking to stimulate a conversation. We are seeking to stimulate new ideas. We are encouraging those of us in the human rights community, those of us who are committed to the principles of democracy and equality and freedom, to serve as penholders, to take on the responsibility of being penholders for the future that we want to see and refuse to cede the space to those with a more colonialist and imperialist ideology of what they want to see. And we think our blueprint is a good place to start that conversation, but we would be equally happy to see better ideas propagate and for there to be a vibrant discussion and a vibrant debate about what the future should be, as opposed to asking what the future should be to end conversation and to continue occupation and apartheid. I'll pause there.
Great. Thank you very much to both of you. I have to give a talk next month in a conflict resolution class about sort of alternative possibilities for Israel-Palestinian sort of reconciliation. And your book is going to give me a lot of arguments to advance to speak to students that look, the current U.S. Israeli centered peace process is not the only game in town. So thanks for doing the heavy lifting in terms of trying to think through this particular topic and offer a vision that's inclusive, that's democratic, that's rooted in international law, and that's one that can, I think, rally, a lot of global public opinion. So I'm going to play devil's advocate here now and try and push you a little bit on some of your arguments. So if you argue that the sequencing of focusing on Israeli crimes has to come first before talking about questions of governance and statehood, the big question is, well, how do you do that? And what's the takeaway from the last 2 years when the international community, forget apartheid, couldn't stop apartheid? It couldn't stop a genocide that I would argue is still ongoing. And not only could it not stop a genocide, it's it's an active participant in the genocide. And I'm talking about, let's leave other countries aside for a moment, the Western liberal democracies, the countries that claim to be liberal democratic. Um, uh, it would suggest that what you're proposing here is very appealing intellectually and normatively, but the takeaway over the last 2 years is that the international community is perfectly fine with not just ignoring a genocide, but actively subsidizing it, which raises questions about, how do we get to a point where we can actually get the international community to put pressure on Israel to stop its crimes. And in this case, it's not just apartheid, it's the crime of crimes, the crime of genocide. So how would you respond to that sort of, broad question that I think most people would have at the front of their mind when they read your book?
No, this is a chapter that we dedicate in the book about when the blueprint becomes relevant, when it's ripe for the blueprint. And the practical scenario we envision is a combination of international pressure and domestic pressure that leaves the Israeli public and the Palestinian public looking for an off-ramp, looking for a solution, because they become tired of becoming internationally isolated, global public opinion reviling the crimes of the Israeli government and not welcoming Israelis in their countries. Sanctions expanding. Just this week, Norway announced that it was cutting diplomatic relations with Israel. Belgium announced expanding its arms embargo on Israel. There are definitely political circumstances that could serve as a tipping point for that. I strongly believe that there will be no peace, not for Israelis, certainly not for Palestinians, so long as the occupation continues. And as a mother of three children, I also believe that ultimately a parent wants security and stability for their child. And I cannot imagine that every Israeli mother wants to see their son or daughter conscripted to fight in these horrendous, shocking wars in perpetuity. And I think that's the only alternative to what we have. In terms of the broader sort of political shifts taking place, I would just say, the history is rife with black swan moments. And what's most critical about black swans is you don't really know when they come, but they come. And there are dramatic moments when public opinion changes to create new political realities, whether it's the fall of the Berlin Wall, whether it's the Arab uprisings. History has many such moments. But I do think we are seeing glimmers of change particularly in the United States, where it can no longer be taken for granted that the US government will continue to back and support Israel in perpetuity because of the dramatic political shift in opinion. I don't think I ever imagined that we would have political candidates running for office specifically on the platform that they will not support continued military assistance to Israel. And I think the election of Zohran Mamdani was a national referendum on that question, as much as it was on domestic, local New York City issues. So there's definitely a change in sentiment. The polls are not lying to us when they say that between 70-80% Democratic voters do not want to continue military aid to Israel. When the Israeli government is trying to get ahead of this by itself, saying that it wants to wind down U.S. military assistance to Israel so that it no longer becomes the political hot button issue it has become. But, envisioning a better future in the current reality that we live in, not just with respect to Gaza and Palestine, but on so many other levels, where we are seeing real time the collapse of whatever remains of the international legal order, is difficult, and optimism is difficult in the pessimism that we are forced to swallow every single day. But if the international community is going to resist the complete failure and catastrophe of the international legal order, if Prime Minister Carney's words are going to ever amount to more than rhetoric, then there is an opportunity for the international community to do a lot more. Because I hope that people increasingly understand that Palestine is the bellwether for the survival of the international legal order, and it will not be able to sustain the norms of international law, the norms of armed conflict, the norms of non-aggression, the norms of international courts of justice making decisions, unless they are respected in Palestine.
Um, Let me ask you a question then. No, I agree about those observations. I mean, there's the shifts in public opinion, the Mamdani election. Who thought that we'd ever live and see a moment where, candidates for Congress would stand up and say, I'm not going to take APAC money. All of those are great things. Translating those shifts in public opinion into political power, is where I think the next battle lies. And there's room for optimism now. Let's say if we project forward, we get to a moment where we have a Mamdani-like or Bernie Sanders-like president who really understands this conflict and is willing to take a courageous stand. I suspect if we ever have that shift, and let's say there's a parallel shift just to push this possibility further, a parallel shift in, let's say, Congress, where you have a critical mass of congressmen and women who, are willing to abandon the old failed U.S. Middle East policy. Um, if you were to have that moment, I suspect someone like Bernie Sanders and his foreign policy advisors would say, look, um, we just have to go back to the two-state settlement. Most countries in the world have, recognized the two-state settlement. Much of international law calls for an Israeli withdrawal to the 67 borders and a Palestinian state in those territories occupied since 1967. That's what the, recent 2024 International Court of Justice ruling suggests. We don't need any other vision or any other plan. Let's just go back to what was envisioned in the late 1980s and sort of let's supercharge sort of the Oslo process and get it to sort of two separate states. That's all we need. Thanks for the book, guys, but we already have an outline. That strikes me as being sort of what I think someone like Bernie Sanders and his foreign policy advisors and many people in the international community, based on voting records at the UN General Assembly, would support. What would you say to that?
I think you're not entirely off base there, in that if the type of pressure that the blueprint requires to become relevant were to come into play, were to sort of, if all the factors that needed to happen would converge to create such a moment, there's a very good chance that people would say, well, you know what, let's just do the two-state solution instead. The problem with that is that Israel refuses. So what we're talking about here is creating pressure on Israel to take a different path, which does not include apartheid, which does not include permanent occupation, which does not include genocide. And if that type of pressure to make that sort of change ultimately leads Israelis to adopt Israeli leadership to adopt and endorse and actually earnestly work toward a just two-state solution. I won't say there's nothing wrong with that, but that's a much better outcome than we're in today.
Hmm.
The point here, though, is that Israel is the biggest obstacle to any sort of two-state solution or any just resolution or outcome in the Israel-Palestine situation today. And in accepting that it is that biggest obstacle, accepting that it is, completely obtuse and working openly to prevent that from ever happening, not just this government, but the previous ones for decades as well, that the international community has to have a different positive vision for what it's demanding of Israel. It can't just say, do the thing you constantly saying you're not going to do. There has to be a next stage. And if the type of pressure, if the we may have said this already, but if the international community accepts that Israel is an apartheid state, and that it accepts that genocide has taken place, and takes that to the next sort of logical conclusion, which is that a regime that sort of is that is an apartheid regime and is a genocidal regime does not have the legitimacy to continue to rule, especially over people that it doesn't even feign to give democratic rights or status to, then what's the next sort of policy step? And and while you're right that it's easy to fall back to what we know before, especially because it preserves a lot of the um, sort of holy grails that the international community has historically clung to, like the need for a Jewish state, like the need for Palestinian self-determination with statehood. Um, you know, those are great if there's a path toward them. But if there's no path toward them and the alternative is just stepping into the abyss, then you're just completely stuck. I think we called it a diplomatic vortex in the book. What we hope to do here is by providing the vision of what could actually happen as an alternative, that it's no longer stepping into the abyss, that it's imaginable, that policymakers, whether it's Bernie Sanders or the Israeli de Klerk, that they say, you know what, the current situation is too fraught, is not sustainable. Obviously that's not the situation today, but in a place where all that pressure has been brought, that that all of a sudden they're willing to consider alternatives. And by putting alternatives on the table, you make it far more likely that somebody will give it a chance. And again, our point here is not to say that we've written the perfect plan. Our point here is to say that we have, and we hope that we've proven that there are alternatives, that there is a different way forward. And that alone should, in theory at least, do quite a bit to push policymakers and activists and regular people to demand something different, to say that no, there are other options. Here's one. If you don't like it, come up with a better one. But the idea that we're just stuck with this two-state paradigm because it's all that we have is frankly BS.
Hmm. Great. Okay, so let me ask you two other big questions here before we shift to audience questions. So, we're dealing in hypotheticals. Let's deal with sort of concrete realities. Sarah, when you were speaking, you said, Oslo has failed. We really have a one-state apartheid reality. There's no plan to replace the Oslo framework. Well, many people in the international community and public intellectuals and some of my colleagues at Georgetown would say, well, I beg to differ. There is an alternative to the Oslo framework. It's called Donald Trump's Gaza 20-point peace plan. And that's just not sort of a plan that was devised by Kushner and Tony Blair. This is a plan now that has the support of all of the leading countries in the Arab and Islamic world. They've all issued statements praising the plan. And just to take it a step further, the Donald Trump Gaza 20-point peace plan is now part of international law. because on November the 17th, 2025, there was a vote in the UN Security Council resolution. It passed 13 to 0. Four or five of those countries were Arab and Muslim states. And just to add one more point, the leadership of the Palestine Authority has endorsed the plan. So this is sort of, if you listen to Trump and his propagandists, they'll say this is not a U.S. Israeli centered imposed plan. This is a plan that has the support of many countries in the international community, particularly in the Arab Islamic world, and it has the force of international law because you have a UN Security Council resolution, which arguably, we can talk about this, has a lot of weight in terms of international sort of power and legitimacy, arguably more relevant than the International Court of Justice advisory ruling in 2024. So people would say that's the plan. And yes, there's a possibility of Palestinian statehood if you look at the plan down the road. At least it ends a genocide. It gives people in Gaza a sort of an opportunity for a better life. If you saw the PowerPoint presentation that Jared Kushner presented in Davos last week, and you knew nothing about the plan, nothing about this conflict, it looks very attractive. Gaza looks like another Dubai. Why not jump onto that train and ride it? Because all the other alternatives seem to be a lot less achievable and possible. So that's the plan that's on the agenda now for the international community, and countries are signing up to sort of support it. So how do you respond to where we are right now at this particular moment, especially in the aftermath of what I consider to be that horrific UN Security Council resolution, which effectively gives the Gaza Strip to Donald Trump as his personal property without any checks and balances? There's a 2-year review period, yes, but I mean, who seriously thinks that in 2 years there's going to be another vote at the UN Security Council that would reject the plan? Everything suggests it would be ratified. And so, when you look at where we are right now, it's a very dark moment for the prospects for peace and justice. Everything is moving in the direction of the Israeli government, of the Trump team, and of Arab dictators who, love this plan because it satisfies their national security concerns. Could you speak to, this particular aspect of the Israel-Palestine conflict and questions of conflict resolution, because it's very much on the global agenda?
Well, a couple of things. The 20-point plan, I think, is best described as a Gaza reconstruction plan. And it seeks to really erase the existence of Palestinians as human beings with full panoply of rights, including the right to self-determination. It instead treats Palestinians in Gaza, it doesn't even speak to Palestinians in the West Bank, as a humanitarian problem, as a question of aid and reconstruction. And I think that the reason why this plan was accepted by the Security Council was not because anyone had any faith or confidence in the non-existent actual planning for the future. I think it refers to, future solutions for aspirations for Palestinian self-determination, not even a right to self-determination. So I don't think we can actually call it a viable plan for Israel-Palestine. And if anything, the sort of evolution of the Board of Peace and these new bodies that are being created makes very clear that at best it will replace the colonial overseers over Gaza with a new set of foreign rulers, given that there's zero Palestinian participation. In fact, I heard Palestinian officials speaking yesterday who confirmed that neither the Palestinian leadership of the PLO or the PA were consulted in any way, shape, or form with the development of the peace plan, the selection of the technocratic committee of Palestinians, and so forth. And so I don't think Palestinians have actually been part of this process at all. So to the extent that that is the viable alternative, is it more viable than ongoing genocide and full displacement? I'm not sure. I don't know. Are we entering a new sort of model of governance such that people can be subjects in perpetuity without even citizenship? Let's say take the Emirati model of corporate, effectively corporate statehood,
Hmm.
possibly. But I don't think that those are desirable or preferable. And what we're hoping to do is to offer an option that is actually desirable and preferable to people around the world and to people who share the values of democracy and human rights and equality. The bigger question, perhaps, is whether those values, as enshrined by law, will survive or persist anywhere in the world. Our current president does not believe that those are priorities, does not believe in international law, does not believe that the UN Charter or the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights matter at all. So we may well be walking into a global future where none of us has those rights or those freedoms.
Hmm.
But that would be a much bigger problem than just Israel-Palestine. I don't think it's a problem that's unique to Israel-Palestine.
If I could just add to that, I agree obviously with everything that Sarah Lee said, but I want to just say that I agree with what you said earlier in your question as well, Nader. You know, this is an incredibly dark moment, and in the 4 years that Sarah Lee and I have been working on this book, I've never felt as cynical and pessimistic about the chances of reaching a place where this can be implemented than I am today. However, and this is a big however, as you said, there is another plan. And that's a tragedy. That's a tragedy because so many people have ceded the space of ideation, of putting forth positive visions. And I really do believe that, one of the reasons that the Trump plan came, aside from the fact that, Trump is a sort of a bully who's pushing the weight of American might to get what he wants around the world in ways that maybe weren't unspeakable, but people thought we were behind us. You know, if there were other practical plans, and we spoke about this as well. Unfortunately, we didn't have the $2 million to get a table at dinner at Mar-a-Lago to present the blueprint to Trump before he came up with the 20-point plan. But who knows what would have happened if there were alternatives presented to him aside from the Kushner-Witkoff Netanyahu model of permanent Israeli and American control over Gaza. And it's critical. It's absolutely critical that as individuals, as organizations, as a movement, and as citizens of countries around the world, that we do not cede that space to people like Jared Kushner, that we do not allow this lie that there are no alternatives, but the one that they are proposing,
Hmm.
because that effectively consecrates their ideas as inevitable. And I think that we're at a particularly low moment as far as that's concerned. But if we don't keep pushing and proposing alternatives and demonstrating that they're viable, then there's no chance of reaching them.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly the value of your book because, given the fundamental injustice at the heart of this Gaza 20-point peace plan, which really is a repackaged sort of neo-colonial plan that has echoes of the old British mandate, but now it's an American sort of Anglo-American mandate. It's going to fail eventually because it's predicated on denying Palestinians, their basic, human rights and national rights. And then people are going to ask, well, what's the alternative plan? And so I think what your book does is it provides us with that sort of alternative vision for how we can solve this conflict when inevitably Trump's Gaza plan will implode based on its own contradictions. How do you respond to sort of an argument that some people might have is that, both of you here are being more Catholic than the Pope, meaning you're prescribing this vision for, a democratic, end to apartheid sort of settlement for Israelis and Palestinians, when based on polling and based on how Israelis vote and where they are right now and the political preferences of Palestinians, it's far away from the vision that you've laid out here in the book. I mean, Israelis tend to vote on the political right now increasingly. The vast majority of them are supportive of, Netanyahu's policy in Gaza, despite having objections to his internal rule within Israel. And most Palestinians, when they're polled, they vote for different Palestinian factions or political parties, Hamas, Fatah, etc. So you're coming up with this alternative plan, and people will say, you're being a bit presumptuous here in terms of prescribing solutions for Israeli Palestinians. When they're polled, they seem to want something very different. How do you respond to that critique?
I can jump in first here, and then certainly love to hear your thoughts as well. But well, a joke first. I think that with the current Pope, there's lots of people who think they're more Catholic than the Pope these days. Um, you know, there's a few aspects to what you said there. One is regarding Palestinians, but to frame all of what I'm about to say, I just want to say that there was one word I objected to um, in the title of this book, and we actually say quite clearly in the book, this is not a peace plan. And it's not a peace plan because it does not prescribe the final outcome. It does not prescribe how Israelis and Palestinians should live. What it says is that the crimes of apartheid and occupation need to end, and this is how that can happen. And only after that happens, in the absence of a Donald Trump type figure who, instead of posing his real estate ambitions on Palestine, imposes his democratic ambitions on Palestine, in the absence of that, we there needs to be excuse me, lost my train of thought there. Um, so it's not a peace plan. We're not saying that there should be one state or two state. What we are saying is that, those questions can be resolved if you end the crimes of apartheid and occupation first. Now, with regards to Palestinian political polling and all of that, it's important to remember that Israel has worked very diligently for the past 100 years through displacement, through political oppression, through administrative detention and disappearances, through, intelligence control over the political and education and even religious systems in many ways. They have worked to stymie the emergence of any effective Palestinian leadership, of a Palestinian polity that can act as one sort of political group that can look at the broader actual political interests and needs of Palestinian people, which is not to say that I know that better than any Palestinian. I certainly don't. What I do know is that there's almost zero possibility to express or manifest Palestinian political aspirations in the current reality. And to suggest that the Palestinian Authority, which was created in order to implement the Oslo process, which we can see in retrospect was designed, at least on the Israeli part, to cement and really just entrench Israeli military and political control over the entire territory and all the people in it, that it's not exactly free choice there.
Mhm.
You're it's not valid political representation, not Hamas and not the Palestinian Authority. With regards to Israelis, um, you know, I often say I would often remind people that apartheid South Africa was a democracy for white South Africans.
Mhm.
That was their experience of it. And for Jewish Israelis, their experience of the current regime, and as it has been for the past 80 something years, is one of a relatively liberal democratic state that they live in. They obviously, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in pushing out all the aspects that we describe and that human rights and other activists have described in great detail for decades. Um, but without raising the
Okay.
cost such that Israelis are forced to deal with and to actually contend with the oppression and the costs of the occupation of apartheid, both economically at home, both fractures within their own society, both of which have been on high on the agenda in Israel for years before the genocide even, combined with the increased international isolation, which, as you said, is quite fluid and what seemed promising a year and a half ago seems quite different today under a Trump reality. However, if you look at the street and you look at public opinion around the world, there's never been a more supportive humanity for Palestinian liberation. And And we have to put faith in that bringing us to a place where these things are possible. And as I said before, it's not that, we think that a one democratic state is the answer for Israelis, for Palestinians, for Israel-Palestine. It's that it's an alternative to the illegal, unacceptable, unsustainable regimes of apartheid and occupation. And, if the Oslo process did not end those illegal and unacceptable realities, then there has to be an alternative. And if the pressure, if the blueprint is adopted by 193 minus Israel and the United States, countries around the world, and it does lead to that kind of pressure, and the result of that is to go back to the two-state solution, that's still better than today. And so, the I don't think that aspirations and a proof of concept that there can be something different is necessarily dictating how people should live or undermining the ways that they're expressing their aspirations today.
Okay, good. Look, we are just past the 1 hour mark, and I want to leave time for audience questions and answers and interventions. And so I'm going to ask Alex if he has access to those questions to read out a few of them one by one, and then we'll get to as many as we can before we have to wrap up. Alex?
Yeah, thanks, Nader. Let me have a look here now. So, one question that we have, and it may kind of span a couple of our attendees here is, even with this blueprint, how can we build hope among people who call Israel-Palestine home to support that blueprint, and what is the best way to get people around the world to help build that hope? Another question that we have, um, bear with me here. Um, One of our attendees was curious about specifically some of the Palestinians, the views of some of the Palestinians that you interviewed regarding your blueprint. How do they view the blueprint? View it in terms of its how realistic it is, based on your conversations with them, and then
Let's just take these two questions, okay? And we'll come back to you,
perfect,
Alex. So the
perfect.
first question is about what's the strategy of getting to the blueprint, right? I think that's the first question. What do we have to do politically, organizationally to get to the blueprint? And the second question is what did the Palestinian interlocutors think about your blueprint plan? Over to you.
I mean, I'll take the first one. In a perfect world, we would have the resources and organizational capacity to present the blueprint to as wide an audience as possible. Obviously, Mike and I have been trying to do the best that we can to promote the idea, to present it to policymakers. But that is an effort that requires a great deal more outreach that unfortunately we immediately have the capacity for. We would love to present this to an audience of Israelis and Palestinians. Unfortunately, we can't travel to Israel or Palestine right now since we've been banned and wouldn't be allowed into Gaza, of course, under any circumstance. But so it is practically harder, but we have had people approach us wanting to turn the blueprint into a manifesto. We are hopeful that civil society partners whom we've engaged with on this plan will take it up. We hope that scholars will critically engage with this book because I think the policymakers are going to be the last to come for reasons that everyone can understand.
Mhm.
I'll just add to that. This book does not attempt to be a panacea, and actually its scope is quite limited. And one of the reasons that we did not fully address the question of how do you get to that point is because there are people who are working on that. There's the BDS movement. There's, solidarity movements around the world. There's even, J Street and the two-state supporters who are working in whatever capacities and strategies they have to change the current reality such that it's conducive for a different one. And what we're offering here is a complementary tool for all of those campaigners to say, and here's what could happen next. Because we found in a Sarah Lee's story in the beginning and similar ones that I and I'm sure many of you all in the audience have also encountered, it's is like, okay, but what then? That's a place where cognitively a lot of people get stuck. And we really hope that providing this document, this book, this idea can help accelerate and strengthen those movements that are working to bring us to the point where political will exists or where it's possible. With regards to the second question in Palestinian interlocutors, I'll start with the annoying answer, which is that, there's no one Palestinian answer to anything, and we spoke to a lot of people who had a lot of different views. The I'd say the most catch-all response that I can summarize here is that people are hungry for fresh ideas. They understand that there is no path forward right now, that the Palestinian leadership has completely failed, both in maintaining Palestinian political unity and putting forth any sort of Palestinian agenda, and certainly, providing any direction for the movement, that it was completely undercut and subjugated by the Oslo process, and by providing an alternative to that, not as an alternative sort of end vision, not as a vision of what Palestinian liberation looks like, but about how to strengthen the movement of getting there. People were supportive of that. Um, we obviously had many criticisms, um, mostly Palestinians, but others have also expressed disappointment that we leave the refugee question um, not fully answered. And we understand that. We have a whole chapter in the book about sort of why we made those choices, and why we don't think it's necessarily contradictory to reaching a resolution to those questions. And likewise for Israelis, not only the incredulous sort of leap that we're asking folks to make to a place where they're willing to envision giving.
We may have lost Mike. I would think he might be frozen for everyone. Oh, now
Okay,
he's
yeah,
Yeah.
go
back.
ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
And for Israelis also, one of the things that we put a lot of effort into is making sure that this is something that Israelis can live with too, because they're the ones who have to cede that power, and they're not going to do so if they think that it would lead to national self-destruction. So, balancing all of those things obviously creates tensions between different parties and what they sort of their ideal aspirations are, and certainly the ways that they express them in the current political moment. But overall, it's been positive. We were encouraged by almost everybody that we spoke to proceed with this project, whether they took issue with certain pieces of it or not. But that's part of the beauty of the process, is that all of those criticisms ultimately influenced and contributed to the shape of what the final product was.
Great. Alex, do you have a couple more questions you can read out to us?
Yeah, so trying to kind of combine, I guess, a couple of questions. We've been asked about both kind of Palestinian interlocutors and also Israeli interlocutors. And so, did you notice differences in terms of inputs for the blueprint based on these two groups? And if so, what were the major ones?
Yeah, so go
Um,
ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I don't know that I notice a difference in inputs, and Mike was closer to the process of talking to our interlocutors in Israel-Palestine, so he may know more. But I think one common question I've been hearing from Palestinians, or maybe Arabs, is just sort of a sense of disbelief that post-genocide Israeli Jews would ever want to live as equals alongside Palestinians. They see the polls of what Israelis say they believe. I'm a little more suspicious in terms of the extreme views that are expressed in these kinds of opinion polls. I think it sometimes, I don't know. But I do think that there is a very strong sense that the genocide and the ongoing occupation and all of the brutality it entails is not just a responsibility or the fault of the Israeli government, but that it has such wide scale popular support in Israel. that seems to be in the minds of Palestinians just the impossibility of returning to a pre October 7, you know, plausibility of living as neighbors. Um,
Yeah. Is there another question you have, Alex?
We're a little bit light in the Q&A, to be completely honest, but
Okay.
we do have one which kind of leans into history and kind of the essentially how do we rewrite or address kind of the historical underpinnings within this blueprint. So when uh, when this was the blueprint was being developed, how did you look at history and how do you kind of rewrite some of the past injustices by showing that they occurred, if you will?
Yeah, let me just sharpen that question a bit because it's one that I have here. Because you mentioned in the introduction that there are possible historical or comparative cases that can illuminate the subject of your book. So, what are those cases where, particularly what I'm thinking about now is you have a case where there's mass atrocities, in this case, genocide, and then the two sides that are involved envision some sort of future where they can live together post-genocide. Are there any historical examples that can illuminate, the topic of Israel-Palestine that you drew upon in writing this book?
Yeah. I have a few different answers there because we learned a lot of different things from different contexts and different comparative studies. As far as living together, and I think in the beginning of your answer, you meant to say it's hard to believe that Palestinians would live with Israelis, necessarily. But I have an article about this that came out today in New Lines magazine. My mother was a child Holocaust survivor whose family returned to the Netherlands after the war, and I think that what people I think fail to grasp in the middle of a moment like this is that people are ready to move on. People want to live their lives, and it's not that they choose the perfect way to do that. It's that they find themselves in a new situation, and you make do. You just figure out how to move forward, and there's you may not forgive, you may not forget, but people will want to live their lives and prosper in whatever way they can. Um, with regards to the comparative studies, I have a few sort of lessons that I often bring up in these talks. The first one is from Northern Ireland, where the larger political question has not been resolved. And yet there was a transformation that was put into place that that ended the occupation, that ended, bombings in London, that ended, Catholic and Protestant kids being shot in the streets, and it didn't resolve the issues, and there's still problems of paramilitaries and violence and state control, and obviously Brexit has thrown new wrenches into that entire equation, but it's an immensely better situation today than it was before, and that's sometimes good enough. Not because you shouldn't try and resolve everything, but because A, better is better than worse. And B, it seems a lot more possible to address those larger political issues today than it would have prior to the Black Friday Agreement. With South Africa, um, that it's possible to integrate security forces and transform a regime that was effectively loyal to one ethnic group into a largely imperfect and yet democratically responsive state that, with one of the better constitutions in the entire world, and that they did so without large-scale political violence or civil war. That, the security forces didn't launch a revolt. That with enough supervision and the right mechanisms, and obviously the requisite political will, that these things are possible. And it's not perfect. I've been to South Africa several times. I've visited the townships. I've you know it, there are versions of apartheid and aspects of apartheid that live on and have probably even been strengthened in the post-apartheid reality. And yet it's possible to create change. And one of the things that I heard from a Palestinian interlocutor who was a senior official in one of the Palestinian security force bodies, was that he was talking to me and preaching to me really about how simply changing the reality can change people's perceptions and their political imaginations. That, if you simply stopped enforcing restrictions on movement in Israel-Palestine and people started to understand that they can occupy the same spaces without, um, facing, you know, uh, without being killed, without, all of the things that people fear will happen to them in such a situation, that all of a sudden it becomes possible to imagine a different future. And that I think ties into what I started with here, which is that once you change the reality on the ground, once you change the experience of individuals and people within a society, within different societies, that the possible that the scope of what's possible begins to transform, and hopefully in positive ways. Obviously, it can go in the other way as well, and spoilers are always an issue. And but I think that's my main answer.
Great. I caught Sarah Leah yawning a few times, and that's completely understandable given the very busy schedule that she keeps.
I'm so jet lagged. I just got back from Beirut and
There
I
you
was
go. There you go. That's what I
4
was
a.m.
referring
today.
to. Completely understandable. And so it's getting late in the night in Beirut time, according to my calculation. So I won't keep you any longer. I just wanted to end with, I mean, you mentioned, I think it's a really great idea, and I want to encourage both of you to sort of pursue this, that the idea of a manifesto is a really good sort of idea to sort of think about that comes out of this book, because a manifesto can easily get circulated. If people want deeper reference, they can refer to your book. People can sign on to it. It can generate momentum. So I think that's something that I would strongly encourage you both to try and develop further. I think the book is, we're really in debt to both of you for thinking through some of the, deeper questions about how we get to a better future. And so the book is wonderfully written. It's very compelling. It's really worthy of an international symposium to sort of bring people together to sort of think through how we can envision, the type of future that I think most people, when you ask about them, just in the abstract, a future where Israelis and Palestinians can live in safety and security and dignity, in a land that they have an attachment to. I think that's something that if you just pull anyone off the street and pose that question, most people instinctively would agree with that basic idea and premise. The challenge is, how do we get there? And so your book goes a long way in answering some of those questions. And I want to thank you both for writing the book, and hopefully there'll be many more opportunities for us to engage on some of the core arguments that you advance in the book. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks
thanks.
everyone for coming.
Thanks everyone for listening. Stay in touch and donate to Don.